Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. My name is J. Stephen Roberts. I'll be your host. Tonight's episode is going to be the final installment in our Fourth Crusade podcast series. And the topic is going to be the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 and the legacy of the Fourth Crusade. In our previous podcasts, we have discussed pretty much the whole course of the Crusade. We talked about the calling of the Crusade, the attack on Zara, and we talked about the attack on Constantinople itself. And now we're going to talk about what happened once Constantinople actually fell, once the city was put to sack by the Latin invaders, and kind of what happened in terms of history's memory of the Fourth Crusade, how the Fourth Crusade is remembered, the impact it had on history, and its place in the Crusades as they're remembered today. So let me go ahead and introduce our panel for this podcast. Rand Brown is with me. Rand, how are you doing?
Pretty good, man. Good to be on.
Great. And we've got Joe Vicinanzo back with us. Joe, welcome. Thanks.
Hi, thanks a lot.
And Paul Copenhagen will be joining us as well. Paul, glad to have you. How are you doing?
Glad to be back. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the topic. Following the fall of Constantinople in April of 1204, the Venetian and French troops, as well as the Western ex-residents of the city, put Constantinople to sack. This went on for 3 days. Most medieval cities taken by force were sacked, but there was a particular obsession with loot in this army engendered by the debts to the Venetians. At least that's what Jonathan Riley Smith thinks. A large portion of the sacking army was made up of Latin ex-residents who felt particularly vengeful after having been expelled from the city during the siege. That's kind of interesting. I thought that was sort of a noteworthy aspect of the sacking of Constantinople, and indeed of the siege of Constantinople. There were a lot of Westerners involved in the attack on the city who had been residents of the city and had been, in fact, expelled from Constantinople by the Byzantine government, as a precaution during this Latin siege. So, as we've come to this point in the podcast, we've really covered all the major events, and I really just want to get some thoughts from each of you about the sack itself. The sack obviously is an incredibly controversial event. There were obviously atrocities committed that have gone down in history as incredibly negative stains on the legacy of the Crusades, if you will. Although, as we've kind of established in previous episodes of this podcast, it's sort of controversial to even refer to the Fourth Crusade as a crusade, considering the fact that it really derailed and went against the wishes of the church pretty early on. So I would like to ask each of you your opinions on the sack. Joe, I want to start with you. What do you think of the sacking of Constantinople? Was this your typical medieval sack? Was there something unusually ruthless going on here? What do you think?
Well, it was by no means a typical sack. This was the largest city in the Christian world by orders of magnitude. Constantinople was about 400,000 people at the time, when Paris was about 60,000. For the Knights of the Crusade, and more importantly for the Venetians, this was the big kahuna. This is the ultimate prize. There is nothing else that they could have actually come into contact with that could offer the sort of opportunity that they saw here. The taking of Zara was one thing, and they thought that was a pretty substantial haul. But Geoffrey de Villardouin, he talks about he says that in his estimation, 2/3 of the wealth of the world was held in Constantinople. Clearly, that wasn't the case, but it was the biggest prize that anyone had ever seen. Any of these people had ever seen. Many of them, of course, were very young and had never seen any sort of city of the sort. So, yeah, they went a little bit nuts.
So it's kind of like the temptation was just too much. I know Jonathan Phillips talked about how immediately after the city was captured, there was sort of this effort made by the Greek clergy to appeal to the sense of Christianity in the Latins and get them to, maybe just take over the city without actually putting it through this horrific sack. But that appeal was lost on them.
Right, and a large part of that was because you're dealing with a whole bunch of young men who've been sitting outside this boring city, like in a boring siege outside this city for a year and a half, and you're dealing with these people who have different set of ideals than they do, who treat their, having a different approach toward government than they do. They don't have that same sort of primogenitor ideology that the Franks would have, or even, and certainly didn't have the sort of governmental system of the Venetians. A lot of them, just young men, didn't really know what was going on. They figured these guys, they're out of communion with Rome. They're to them, they're the next. I think that over the course of the time that they spent outside Constantinople, they developed a pretty good disdain for the Greeks and took it out on them in the final events of the sack.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, we have to remember too that this was sort of an army in a state of desperation. There was almost no alternative for the leaders but to sack the city of its wealth in order to deal with their financial problems. So, Paul, I'd like to move on to you if you have some comments. Do you have any comments about the actual sacking of the city, the atrocities, the grabbing of the relics? What are your thoughts on all this?
If anything, this really does underscore the fact of what we've said before, that this really should not be considered a crusade. Sacking a Christian city to this magnitude, to this level, destroying the holy places as well, really puts into my mind, when I was reading the accounts on this, that this is very much a secular army assaulting a city for the sole purpose of plunder. I think you kind of touched on it as well just a moment ago when you mentioned that they sort of were at this point of no return. Sitting outside the gates, they had a choice. They could go home in shame and heavily in debt, possibly facing extreme censure from the church for having even gotten that far. They could have gone back, and that would have been a terrible death knell to their entire endeavor, as well as to any claims of legitimacy as crusaders. So they could have gone home completely in defeat without anything to show for it, or they could press on. They could sort of go big or go home in this instance. And they decided to go big, and they did it with the biggest city, as Joe mentioned, in the Eurasian continent. They decided to go for this, and that was what happened. I think that's what drives them to the levels of depravity that we see. I think that is what brings them to the decision to go ahead and go through with it, despite the threats of excommunication, despite all of the problems that are going to be inherent with destroying and sacking Constantinople. Of course, they don't go as far as destruction, but they basically decide to roll the dice and hope that they can back everybody into a corner. And this is where arguably the biggest criticism of the Fourth Crusade comes from, because instead of following up on the excommunication and the complete condemnation of the entire act, Innocent III is now put in a very difficult position of, well, what do I do now?
You're talking about once Constantinople has been conquered, once the Latin Empire is sort of up and running, if we could even say that.
Yeah.
And he does kind of accept it as
he's
part of Christendom.
He kind of accepts it, and he starts writing letters to French bishops and monasteries to basically say, well, hey, let's make the best of a bad situation and bring Latin books and Latin theology out there. So that he starts asking for learning to send it out to the Byzantine Empire to try and at least make the best of a bad situation, and demands the returns of the relics.
Yeah, interesting. One thing I've always been curious about, I've read a lot of the big primary sources involved with this. How seriously can we take, for example, some of the Greek claims about, soldiers putting a harlot on top of the altar and that sort of thing. I mean, that almost seems like maybe a little bit cartoonish.
Yeah, it does smack of propaganda.
I mean, I don't doubt that horrible things happened. You know, I
Yeah.
just wonder if it was to that extent that, inside Hagia Sophia, you have French knights dancing with whores and having them drink out the chalices and, fornicating with them on the altar and that sort of thing. I mean, that seems like a little bit over the top. But I guess you agree with that, Rand. What do you think, Joe?
Well, you know what? In any situation, the problem is that in this particular situation, actually, that a lot of the people who we are calling crusaders really were mercenaries. Most of the majority of the people who had volunteered for the crusade in order, to take up the cross and actually, get to the Holy Land kind of under their own steam, they had moved on. They'd abandoned the crusade at this point, or they would have, as they would have said it, they had actually continued with the crusade. Boniface and Baldwin, so Boniface of Montferrat and Baldwin of Flanders, the two most powerful nobles in the crusade, had a large number of mercenaries with them. Mm-hmm. So they, people they had hired right before the beginning of this whole thing, just kind of round out their numbers. And those guys had been sticking around the entire time. They were not the ones who were deserting. So even among the vastly diminished crusader host, the people who were left were relatively few crusaders and were largely mercenaries. So I don't necessarily discredit the idea that these mercenaries who suddenly, after the long time that they've been sitting outside these walls, not doing anything in particular and getting kind of fed up with the situation, I don't necessarily think that it's unreasonable to think that they committed some very serious atrocities, including, I don't know, in churches. But yes, it does sound a bit melodramatic, the idea of it's the sort of thing that is always said about like what happens when your enemy takes a place is they put children on spits and things like that.
I would need to clarify my stance, because I don't entirely, I'm not entirely in agreement. It's a little bit, I have a little bit more nuanced thought on that. But yeah, mostly what Joe is saying is very correct. It's there were probably some very isolated incidents where, some really, really nasty stuff went down. And then, the people who knew about that, word gets out. You play you play on a mass societal scale. You play this game of telephone,
right,
that just expands exponentially, and you get stuff like in the opening actions of World War I, with German troops were skewering Belgian babies on bayonets and all this kind of stuff, and it was like, okay, it wasn't like that. It wasn't
right.
quite.
But some children got killed, but not so.
But at the same time, he's also very correct in that, this was a mercenary army, and this was no longer a crusader army. The guys that were in this army they were the ones who stuck around after all the papal censure, after the more idealistic factions had already taken off and discussed and left, and all that kind of thing. So these were guys who really, really didn't care about any religious affiliation whatsoever. These were guys who war was their business, and if they took Constantinople, business was going to be booming.
Right. Yeah.
It was going to be the payday of a lifetime if they took this city. So you're not going to have, I have no doubt that the guys who actually sacked Constantinople, they were not crusaders in any sense of the word, like at all whatsoever. Yeah. These were professional mercenaries, and in the medieval world, professional mercenaries were extremely hard bitten. Were an extremely hard bunch of dudes. These guys were guys who did not have any qualms whatsoever about looting churches, sacking monasteries, stripping altars of everything that was worth anything. And they probably didn't hang out with the most genteel of circles, So in their spare time, and as somebody who's still in this line of work, I can tell you that has not changed at all. So it's there's something about that it's just a historical constant of human warfare. So
yeah, very, very good points, guys. So once the sacking was over and the plunder had been divided, at that point, the Latins pretty much implemented this plan they'd made ahead of time to divide Constantinople between the Venetians and the French factions. An emperor is elected. And my understanding is the Venetians were going to have direct control of the patriarchy. So a Venetian patriarch was actually elected, while a French emperor was going to be elected. So you're going to have a French, Latin emperor of Constantinople. And apparently one of the early choices, and it seems obvious, was Boniface of Montferrat, but the Venetians actually blocked him as a choice. That's kind of interesting. And my understanding from what I've read is that is because they considered him to be someone too connected already to the Greek world. He had too many contacts and allies already within the Eastern world, really the Byzantine world, if you will. Which we talked about some of his involvement in his family's involvement in that in previous podcasts. So Baldwin the Ninth of Flanders is instead chosen, and apparently the Venetians felt he would be easier for them to influence, if you will. So, just some comments from you guys on that. Rand, what do you think about that? Well, first of all, does anybody have any comments specifically about the Boniface of Montferrat thing? Or
yeah, well, Boniface was the vassal of Philip of Swabia, the king of Germany, and who was at the time trying to become the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He had very direct connections to the Germans. He also had a lot of connections among the Crusader kingdoms. He was related to just about everybody. It's no wonder that the Venetians did not want Boniface in control of Constantinople, because he would have most likely not really been a puppet, a pawn of theirs. He would not have been dependent on them for his power.
He would have had his own vision of things, possibly.
Yeah, and definitely had his own vision of things. He was conspicuously absent from the siege of Zara. He had never really been a big fan of the Venetians. He had gone along with it because he was, the one who had been put in charge of the crusade, and that was the only route that he really saw forward. But he was never really an ally to the Venetians, and by this point, Venice was really in charge of the whole debacle.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So, Rand, did you have any thoughts on this issue, the establishment of the Latin Empire and the choice of the emperor?
Yeah, it's I think what the Venetians were trying to do is they were trying to avoid replacing one difficult one difficult regime with an even more difficult one that would have been even harder to control. Had Boniface assume the throne. You're right. He was extremely well connected, and if his connections with the Holy Roman Empire, had achieved the sort of success that they were hoping for, they ended up not. But I think the Venetians were looking at that going, if this guy gets in and his relative and Philip of Swabia becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, like, we will have created a monster that we won't even remotely be able to resist. So that's why they go for Baldwin IX, who is, even in somebody as apologetic as Geoffrey of Villehardouin's chronicle, is not made out to be the most mature, savvy leader by any stretch of the imagination. So I think they just kind of went, hey, we can kind of control this guy, let's back him. As far as the formation of the Latin Empire and it being a realistic goal for the Westerners in Greece, I think overall, yes, you've got the Venetians, you've got the Venetian factor at play, and as we know, even according to, I think it was Plato who said this, but money is the sinew of war and all that kind of thing. So the mercantile interests in this are a big deal, but I think really ultimately it was just we're here, let's make the best of it. Let's see how far we can go with this. In a way, the formation of the Latin Empire in Constantinople almost becomes this mocking shadow to the Crusader kingdoms in Palestine. It's sort of the same impulse. It's we're here. Let's see if we can preserve what we've won, and of course it was completely devoid of any of the the ideological nobility of the actual Crusader kingdoms in Palestine. But this was very much a move of expediency to see, I guess, how long the payday could keep coming.
It's almost a bizarre, perverted parody of the First Crusade in some respects.
It is, very much so, and it's almost tragic in that sense to see to see where it went. As far as it being a realistic goal, absolutely not. I mean, I think there were probably even people there at the time who were probably waiting for the other shoe to drop, and for this thing for the bottom to give out on this thing, because it was so shoddily put together. It was you even get that sense from the chronicles from the time. Almost immediately Baldwin and Boniface get into conflict with each other, that even comes to actual blows.
And Baldwin's going to be captured by the Bulgarians pretty much a year after he's crowned emperor. I mean,
and they're surrounded. Not only are they surrounded by hostile neighbors, they are sitting on top of an extremely hostile population.
Yeah.
And culturally, socially, politically, everything. It's just that it was a ticking time bomb from the start. And so, was it a realistic goal for the Westerners? No. I really think it was just a matter of capitalizing as much as they possibly could on what they had won.
Yeah, good point. The interesting thing for me about the Latin Empire, quote, is, the Latin Empire itself has a pretty dismal history. Really, the whole thing. There's several states that are established. I mean, we've got the Kingdom of Thessalonica, which of course is where Boniface, that's sort of his consolation prize for not being made emperor of Constantinople. And that only lasts for like 20 years or something like that. And then there's some territories that sort of exist in some form or another for several centuries, like the Duchy of Athens, I think it is. When I was actually in Athens last summer, and there were some old photographs they had there, which actually showed at the side of the Acropolis this Latin tower, basically, that was there for centuries. And I guess it was taken down by some German classical enthusiasts during the 1800s or something, something like that. So,
never trust a German historian.
Right. Like they thought it was this mar on this classical Greek monument to have this giant Latin tower there.
Yeah, thanks, Byron.
Yeah. Very, very well put. So that's kind of interesting. Does anybody have any further comments on the viability of the Latin Empire, sort of its rather dismal history? Paul, Joe, did either of you guys have anything to add to that? Or
yeah, well, it was doomed from the beginning. It's just grafting on this whole new set of people who some of them had cousins who had been in the upper echelons of Byzantine society earlier, but most of them were complete strangers to the people there. They had just actually taken the city by force and eliminated not only the old imperial family, but the entire aristocracy was essentially exiled, forming, 3 different kingdoms: the Empire of Trebizond with the Komnenoi, the Emperor of Nicaea with the Paleologi, and a despotate of Epirus over in the east, the Adriatic. Essentially, they had very little actual control of what had been the Byzantine Empire. Most of the citizens of Constantinople left. It wasn't even a question of fleeing. Much of the city was burned down during the sack, and no one really wanted to be there after that point. Over the course of the next 30 years, the city went from 400,000 people to 40,000 people, if not less than that. Constantinople was a shell of itself under the Latins, and the people who were so unlucky to call themselves the emperors of the Latin Empire never really lasted very long. Really, in the next 40 years, the most powerful player in the region was the resurgent Bulgarian Empire. The Bulgarians were the big, the heavy hitters for quite a while, until for a brief period when the Greeks took back over under the Paleologi in the 1260s, took back over. But then, of course, the Turks really came to the fore. But yeah, for quite a while there was Baldwin was dead within a year. Boniface, who became king of Thessalonica, was dead within 3. No one really came out of this doing too well. So
yeah, it's like the actual taking of Constantinople was pretty much the high point, if we can even describe that as a high point. But it's incredible. I mean, and the contrast from the Crusader states in Outremer is just incredible too. I mean, the Crusader states in Outremer, the governmental structures that were established there were much more stable. And one thing that was a key to the success of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is that, Baldwin I of Jerusalem, as soon as he got into power, one of the first things he did was establish the local Christians as being able to practice their rites right alongside the Latin clergy. Something like that was rather impossible in this situation, just because there was this just unavoidable tension, I guess, between the Greek and Latin factions here. I did want to move on to you, Paul. So much has been made of the Latin sack of Constantinople as being ultimately responsible for the final collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. This is certainly a claim that seems to have been made by Stephen Runciman in his History of the Crusades. He kind of points out the sack of Constantinople, the conquest of Constantinople in 1204 as this is the moment when it really becomes irreversible for Byzantium. What do you think of that, Paul? Is that accurate?
I don't think that's accurate at all. There's several sieges of Constantinople. Neither one of them that are after the 1204 siege. Neither one of them really particularly weaken Constantinople beyond the point of recovering. There's a couple of other factors that really go into it and play far more of a part in the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 than this siege and the establishment of the Latin Kingdom. Because if you think about it, the Latin Kingdom is in and of itself nothing different than the establishment of a new dynasty in the Byzantine Empire. Arguably, the biggest effect is what Joe mentioned, with the population dropping down to a shadow of its former self, 10% or so of its former self. However, populations rebound within generations. So, we're talking about a period of 250 years from 1203 to basically 1453, during which the population has a chance to rebound, the economy has a chance to rebound, and we know that economies and we know that populations do explode to the point where you can see that very definite resurgence within 250 years. The biggest things that really lead to the 1453, and this is why I have a real problem with the Latin Kingdom assertion is what led to 1453. The real problem with the end of the Byzantine Empire is really that the focus leaves the Holy Land in 1291 with the fall of Acre. And then you have in 1307 the beginning of the trial of the Templars, which is the first real major successful challenge of church power and authority by a secular power, being the Kingdom of France. And you have that breaking of the church power, which is the center of the crusade. You have the entire endeavor in the Holy Land basically back to where it was in 1095, pre-crusading era, because there's no more crusaders in Outremer. And then you have this very large series of political upheavals that go from the trial of the Templars through the 100 Years' War into the Wars of the Roses. And it's a real problem when your two big contenders in the Crusades, France and England, that can consistently field armies, can consistently send thousands of troops overseas, these two are now locked into their own internal squabbles for over a century, and that momentum of crusade dies. And that's really what leads to 1453. Certainly the bad blood that is sown by the Latin Kingdom means that relief is probably not going to be coming anytime soon, but really the West is just too busy with its own problems at this point.
Interesting. Some really good points there, Paul. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, leading up to 1453, I think there's a very good argument to be made that the division of the empire that occurred at that time is not that the empire became less wealthy. The people there were still the wealthiest in Europe and in most cases the Middle East as well. The political control was what was actually divided. There, below the political level, at the level of just basic trade and commerce, things did continue on fairly well and did actually progress in many ways. And there was a bit of a renaissance that actually did take place after the fall of Constantinople, about 50 years afterwards, and continuing on after that point. But unfortunately, because the political division was so severe, the Turks, of course, under Osman later on, were able to consolidate and gradually kind of eat up the smaller, almost feudal, not exactly feudal, but almost feudal remnants of the Byzantine Empire, of the old Roman Empire. Basically just taking over, and in a dynastic way, just as a dynastic change, taking over these things, not even really having to conquer them particularly, to the point where the Turks did think of themselves in some sense as ruling over Rome. That's why in 1453, the Sultan, when he finally took Constantinople, assumed the title of emperor, of imperator, autocrat, and Basileus. The emperor of Rome, and the people who were under the Turkish yoke at that point for the most part for hundreds of years. Even the majority of them were Christian. Yeah, the political divisions that really were engendered by the turmoil after the fall of Constantinople in 1204, what I do believe were what enabled the Turkish advance.
So, kind of what you're saying, Joe, is that in the wake of 1204, we do have these different sort of Byzantine statelets pop up, in opposition to the Latin Empire, and there's three of them.
To each other.
And to each other, yeah. Was some of that kind of going on and starting to happen really under the Angeloi too? Because
absolutely,
because
absolutely.
In the 20 years leading up to the Fourth Crusade, we do kind of have sort of that process going on of that decay of the Byzantine state. Yeah, do you see some of that?
We absolutely had. There had been several attempted revolts against the Angeloi in the previous decade and a half. before the Crusade. And of course, the Fourth Crusade itself could be considered essentially just another Byzantine civil war. So yes, that's why it was so quickly just divided up among these prominent families, the Komnenoi, notably in Trebizond, the farthest from the capital. The previous rulers of the city, Paleologoi and others. But the government of those places continued on without really any particular interruption. It's just that there was no, they lost that unifying factor, and by the time they got it back under Michael Paleologus in the 1260s, it was too far gone, and everyone in the area, the Bulgarians and the Turks, had advanced to the point where they just could never regain that that local hegemony. So
interesting. Yeah, great comments from everybody. So as we kind of come to the end of this discussion, I wanted to put this question out there. What overall legacy did the events of the Fourth Crusade and the brief existence of the Latin Empire have on the history of relations between Eastern and Western Christianity? And this was actually a question you came up with, Rand, and I thought was a really good one, because this is the thing that always comes up when the Fourth Crusade is discussed. I mean, it's sort of this sore point still between modern day Catholics and Orthodox in some respect. So I know that's a huge question. That's a huge topic. I don't want to sort of overwhelm us here at the end of the podcast, but does anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, how has this been sort of this long-term wound between East and West? And anybody who wants to go first, just go right ahead.
I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and jump in here, seeing as how it was my question. It's funny that the whole reason I even came up with that question is, not only in our time of managing Real Crusades history, we've seen it in the comments, and anytime you read something that's disparaging of the Crusades, it always without fail mentions the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, and the Latin Christians turning on the Eastern Christians and all this kind of thing. And there is amongst the Eastern churches, amongst the Eastern rites to this day, there is very much this palpable sense of grievance over the sack of Constantinople and the events of 1204. I even experienced a little bit of that even personally when I was in Jerusalem here just this past summer. I tried to have a conversation with an Eastern Orthodox cleric in the Church of Mary and Jehoshaphat, which is right there at the base of the Mount of Olives. It's a beautiful Crusader, a beautiful church built during the Crusader period. It's a vault that goes kind of down into the ground, big Norman vault that goes down into the side of the Mount of Olives, and it was a very popular burial site for noble women of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. To include, probably the most notable is the burial site of Queen Melisande herself. And when I tried to have a conversation with this Eastern Orthodox cleric about it, he feigned ignorance on any of that and pretended to not know anything what I was talking about, had no idea who any of those people were, had no idea where they were buried or anything like that. And it was, at first I thought it was just an isolated incident, but then the more I interacted with the Eastern clergy out there in Jerusalem, I got the same response with anything related to the Latin Crusader presence in Jerusalem. It was like they didn't even want to talk about Latin Crusaders, or anything related to them. And it was there that it kind of really did hit me that it was like, wow, this is very palpable. Like this is still very real, like even today. And I think really what it probably comes from is a sense of betrayal. I think there is an idea that the events of the Fourth Crusade, here, Latin Christianity was supposed to be helping their Eastern brethren, with the scourge of Islam. They were supposed to be brothers in arms together, and instead they turn into a bunch of mercenaries and they sack they sack the Second Rome. And I think something like that, it's very easy to, perhaps maybe in an exaggerated sense over the centuries, but I think it's very it becomes very easy to finger that as the reason why we now have to put up with 500 years of brutal domination by the Ottoman Turks. Why the jewel that was Constantinople is no longer, and all that kind of thing. I think it's a very emotional point culturally, and I think that's really where you see it. Even to the point where you have popes now. John Paul II, apologizing, for the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Yeah. So it's like, I mean, this is something that is still very, very palpably felt amongst Eastern Christians, and perhaps a little unjustly, perhaps not, but cultural perceptions aren't really too terribly concerned with the details. It's perception is reality.
Yeah.
And I think the perception is that this was a betrayal of one of the worst types, and that is not going to leave a social and cultural consciousness anytime soon.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Rand. And I think, if we're just looking at it historically, I mean, it's really not a fair conclusion to make, because the truth is that both sides kind of betrayed each other consistently. And, the events of 1204, as we've sort of discussed in this podcast, were really brought about by all kinds of happenstance of history and decisions made, both in Byzantine and Latin politics that sort of resulted in this in a way. But yeah, does anybody else have any comments on this? I imagine Paul and Joe, you guys have something to say about this issue.
Well, Pope Innocent III does have something to say about it. Right after the fall of Constantinople, I should say the year after, in 1205, Pope Innocent very, very much did not approve of what had happened. And, he basically saw the future. Here's the quote here. How indeed will a church of the Greeks, no matter how severely she is beset with afflictions and persecutions, return into ecclesiastical union and to a devotion for the apostolic see, when she has seen in the Latins only an example of perdition and the works of darkness, so that she sees now, and with reason, detest the Latins more than dogs? As for those who were supposed to be seeking the ends of Jesus Christ, not their own ends, who made their swords, which they were supposed to use against the pagans, drip with Christian blood, they have spared neither religion, nor age, nor sex. They have committed incest, adultery, and fornication before the eyes of men. They have opposed both matrons and virgins, even those dedicated to God, to the sordid lusts of boys. Not satisfied with breaking open the imperial treasury and plundering the very goods of princes and lesser men, they also laid their hands on the treasures of the church and, what is more serious, on their very possessions. They have even ripped silver plates from the altars and have hacked them into pieces among themselves. They have violated the holy places and have carried off crosses and relics. So the Pope, who, many people have accused of, entirely unjustly, of course, but, of benefiting from this whole thing, definitely spared no words in condemning what had happened. And, frankly, I don't know how the incest part got into it, but hey, he really went after the Crusaders and the sack here. So, but particularly pointing out that, of course, the Greeks are never going to come back to us. Like, this is like, people do say that 1054, when the Great Schism, when the Pope and the Patriarch both excommunicate each other, that's the beginning of the ultimate schism. But really, it's 1204. That's why we don't have a united church between Orthodox and Catholics. That is the single largest nail in that particular coffin. So,
well, I mean, that may be true, Joe. I think that's probably kind of a complicated question, and I think it's probably debatable that's the reason. I mean, I think it's possible.
Yeah, go ahead. Theology is one thing, but murder and rape and theft is something that actually appeals to people on a much more visceral level. So, when you're talking about keeping the churches apart, from the Greek perspective, I think that no, that's what the Latins are about. That's the sort of thing they do. Was probably a more effective argument for the average person than the fact that they include the Son it proceeds from the Father and the Son in the creed. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, this is kind of a huge subject. I mean, I just wonder if there was really any chance of the Greek and Latin churches being fully united, if that was really a realistic goal at all at any point. I mean, it seems to me like well before 1204, there was considerable sort of divergent paths that these two religious traditions were on. But sorry, go ahead, Rand.
Go ahead. Something that needs to be brought up is, and I know it was brought up in Paul's comments about whether or not the sacking the sack in 1204 was ultimately responsible for the final collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. Something that does need to be said is there was a little bit of a coming back together between East and West right before 1453.
That's true.
There was, especially amongst the Italian city-states, there was the Genoans set up a permanent shop there in Constantinople. The Venetians set up permanent shop. I think there was another one that was out there. I can't remember which one, but there was kind of a somewhat of a reconciliation, and you even saw quite a bit reconciliation between actual Western Europe and Constantinople. There's an excellent account of one of the emperor. I think it was one of the Paleogioi. I know I just butchered that, but who visited England during the reign of Henry IV. In the late 1300s, early 1400s, and he was welcomed with this great fanfare, and they celebrated him as the Emperor of Rome, and he was very well received even by the English clergy. But the problem was this was right at the height of the 100 Years' War between England and France, and although the emperor, I can't remember which one he was, but even though he appealed to Henry IV for aid against the Turks, it was kind of like, hey man, we'd love to help you out, but we're currently busy at the moment. Mm-hmm. And there were even quite a few French knights who still went east to go help the Byzantines fight off the Turks. It was incredibly unsuccessful. The biggest episode was the Battle of Nicosia, or Nicopolis. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1380 something, I want to say, where French, a Franco-Hungarian coalition essentially went out to go stand up against the Ottoman Turks, and it was even called in many quarters. It was called the Crusade of Nicopolis, and they were just crushed by the Turks. The Battle of Nicopolis was just a horrific disaster for the Western forces that were trying to relieve Constantinople, and it basically gave the Ottoman Turks free reign over the Balkans and the entire Danube Valley there. So it was there were further attempts to try and shore the rift, to try and come back, to try and help each other out. So much so that, actually the majority of the forces fighting within Constantinople during the siege of 1453 were Westerners. They were Italian troops who were there for who were there in the trade in the trade sectors. And they actually formed the majority of Emperor Constantine's forces fighting within the city. So, there was and you had Western and Eastern Christian dying side by side in 1453. So, there was somewhat of a reconciliation, but I think what happened was with the takeover of the Ottoman Turks and the rise of the Ottoman Empire and just the complete destruction of anything that once was Byzantium, the bad blood had nothing else to compare it to. And once you're sitting under 500 years of Ottoman oppression, it becomes very easy to kind of sit back and go, gee, how did this happen? Oh yeah, the Latins came in 1204 and completely wrecked everything.
Well, and so something that is interesting is that while the Greeks, actually the Greek Orthodox folks are not as upset about it as you might think. It's really the Russian Orthodox. The Russians, like basically from the get-go, the Russian Primary Chronicle records this as like the worst thing that's ever happened in the entire history of the world, 1204. And ever since that point, of course, the Duke of Novgorod was married to a younger daughter of the Angeloi, and basically at that point decided that therefore I'm going to be the new emperor. They have had this idea, which ultimately resulted in them calling themselves Caesar or Tsar, that they have to be taking up this mantle that was the mantle of Rome, and that you can't trust the West. You can't trust the West. You can't trust these Latins. Certainly can't trust the Turks as a result of the 1453. It's actually like the Russian tradition is the one that is the most hostile to the Western, to the Latin Empire, even more than the Greek tradition.
Interesting. Paul, did you have any comments on this particular issue?
I think that I will expand a little bit on what Rand and Joe have mentioned in terms of the gulf that opens up. Rand certainly experienced it firsthand, and Joe mentioned it. Theology is one thing, but the sack of Constantinople is basically another thing entirely. About the only person that I would argue about the only culture or group that the Eastern Christians might despise more than the Latin Christians for the sack and fall of Constantinople are probably the Turks, and that's only because they did it more recently. And they lasted longer. But at the same time, that I think that this sack of Constantinople really created the environment in which the reconciliation. I mean, it was only in 1974 that mutual excommunication was lifted, and the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church in the West were sort of reconciled, at least on the basis of no longer hating each other officially. I mean, that was lifted in 1974. I think we would have seen that centuries earlier had the Fourth Crusade just gone on to Egypt and satisfied the Venetians with plunder from the Egyptian cities like Alexandria and
that would have been so much better.
Cairo. I really think that we would have seen a I think that we would have seen a reunification there, and I think that reunification with that reunification and that sort of renewed sense of purpose, we could have seen the entire crusading endeavor in Outremer, especially around with the new push at the end of the 13th century. I think that would have turned out very differently had the Byzantine Empire been in a position to lend more aid. But as Joe mentioned, the political divisions really hampered the ability of the Byzantines to lend any sort of support in 1291 because they're split up into these different warring factions. They're split up into the Latin kingdom. You have all of these different groups, and that's what really, there's no base of operations anymore when the Turks start to push and wind up kicking the last Crusaders out of Acre in 1291. The Byzantine Empire, at least while it was intact, even if it was, sometimes double dealing behind the Crusaders' backs, it was at least a safe port for the most part. It was the staging area. It was a good place to rest, resupply, and start launching attacks out. Everybody benefited from the Byzantine Empire staying afloat, except for these Venetians that were pushing for this particular attack. And something that was not mentioned earlier, but I've often wondered is how much of this was the Byzantine Empire falling because the Venetians wanted a basis of power to their backs. The Holy Roman Empire to the north was certainly hostile to Italy, to northern Italy. They laid claim to a large chunk of northern Italy throughout their history. So you have these Venetians in northern Italy, and you have off to the you have to the north these hostile people. You have throughout Italy, you have these hostile city states. You have Florence, you have Rome, you have Naples, you have Genoa. You have all of these different city states within Rome, within the Italian peninsula itself, that are all competing against Venice. And here's Venice's golden opportunity. And I don't think they really care about the consequences between East and West. They're looking at it purely politically and geographically, that they can, put into position people that will counterbalance that Holy Roman Empire in the north and give them a good, solid marketplace and a good inroad to the Silk Road in the east. And, they have their backs secure with a Latin kingdom in the east. And I don't think they really cared at all about the consequences. And unfortunately, the rest of the world suffered from their lack of concern.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, as we've looked at the Fourth Crusade, that the events that transpired, I mean, the conquest of Constantinople, Venice was really looking at this as just an issue of its immediate political concerns, and I think that's pretty unavoidable. So, well, I think that's going to pretty much bring us to the end of this discussion of this podcast. This has been a really, really good discussion. As usual, you guys all had great comments, so I'm glad that I was able to have each of you on. This has been the final discussion of the Fourth Crusade. We have gone over the Fourth Crusade, and I think we've covered it fairly well. So I'm glad to have each of you on board for that. Rand, I just want to say I appreciate you helping out with this as usual. Glad to have you.
Absolutely. It's always awesome to be on.
And Paul, I'm glad you could be with us as well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
And Joe, it was great to hear your comments as well. Thanks for being a part of this.
Thanks so much. That was a lot of fun.
Good. Well, we'll have to do something else. We'll have to come up with another topic in the Crusades. I don't know. We've done a podcast about the Third Crusade, about the Fourth Crusade now. I don't know. Maybe
Albigensian Crusade.
I'm sorry.
I said the Albigensian Crusade.
Yeah. I don't know. I could see doing a series about the Fifth Crusade. That's a good one.
Yeah, or even maybe one that can focus on some not quite so depressing, although will be depressing in the long term. But the Ninth Crusade, the last one, Prince Edward, future King Edward I of England.
That is a good one.
Almost coming close to becoming a second Richard.
Does a single episode on the fall of Constantinople with the aborted crusade, attempted crusade by the Hungarians, and then a crusade was called by the Pope, to try to defend Constantinople in 1453. Would that be that work at some point?
It would.
Actually, yeah, that would be a great topic. I would love to do that. And I think this would be a good group to tackle that one too. So. Yeah. We will have to make that one happen.
I do have a very minor correction. It wasn't the reign of Henry IV. He hadn't taken over yet. It was actually still Richard II, who was still king.
Okay.
It was in 1399, and he was visited by John. I don't even know how do you pronounce that?
Paleologus.
Paleologos. Yeah, he was visited by John the VII.
Means ancient word, yeah.
Yeah, he was visited by John the VII Paleologos in 1399, literally a few months before he's overthrown by Henry Bolingbroke.
Wow.
He was kind of making the grand European tour for aid against the Ottoman Turks. So,
yeah, I think it is kind of funny. Like there was always so much connection between between England and Constantinople because of the Varangian connection. Yeah. To the point where even after the fall, like there were like Paleologi who were ended up emigrating to England.
Yep.
Interesting. Well, yeah, we've got quite a array of topics that we will be diving into as these podcasts continue. So this is Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. We upload something new every Monday, either a video or a podcast. Thanks for being with us. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.